Thank you very much for coming today to do this important work around the Columbia River Basin, to come to the traditional territory of the Lummi Nation and the Coast Salish Territory. This is an important day, and the work that is happening today, I think, is going to touch our minds and our hearts, and will allow our negotiators, our governmental officials, our educators, our students to be able to move forward in a way that does the work along the Columbia River Basin. So today at Northwest Indian College and Lummi Nation, we're going to first start with a traditional welcome, and then I'm going to be introducing some other key important people within the community at Northwest Indian College, and then our presenters. I want to introduce myself. I'm Emma Norman. I'm the department chair of the Native Environmental Science program. I've had the distinct honor to be working alongside my peers, my colleagues at Western Washington University, co-planning this event, this collaboration to look and lean towards this good work. With that, I'm going to open it up and have Richard Jefferson, Northwest Indian College student and Lummi Nation tribal member and youth, to open us up with a drum. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. I'd like to call up Tim Ballou Sr., Lummi tribal member, Native Environmental Science faculty member, former chairman of the Lummi Nation, great fisherman, just a good guy.
First of all, I want to welcome everybody to Northwest Indian College. Northwest Indian College has done some very, very great things, not only for members of our community, but members from other communities in the Pacific Northwest. We need to thank the young man for singing that song for us today. That song represents who we are as, I don't know if we want to call it Lummi, Lactimus, but it's the Lactimus song of who we are and how we survived the great flood, the water. Today we talk about Columbia River, yeah? And Columbia River is just important as us here at the Pacific Northwest as the people who inhabited Columbia River years ago. I'm very happy to be here. I'm glad Emma, I guess, called upon me. I'm from the Balch Celestine family here and the Blue Salmon family within our community. I need to introduce my wife. She's faculty here at Northwest Indian College. She's department chair for her program, Laurel, from the Swinomish tribe. Just like Swinomish and Lummi, the water really represents who we are and defined us as Indigenous people. And it's so important for us to talk about Columbia River because we've always talked about the river, I think, for centuries. Maybe one of the good things that happened was the federal policy about the Mitchell Act that affected the Columbia River, and I'm really hoping that we can maybe change policy. More importantly, I really hope that there's a follow-up from this celebration that we're doing today and tomorrow at Western Washington University. We really need to keep the fire burning when we talk about something like this, because it not only affects Native Americans, but it affects everybody and the natural world that we live in today. And sometimes I think we forget the natural world is still here. So today, I'm asking that you have a little patience with how we're going to conduct business here. We want to kind of throw the watch away. We want to turn our cell phones off if you have your cell phones. And out of respect of the building, please, no food or drinks in this building. You know, we really have to give thanks for having a facility like this, because that's part of who we are as Native Americans, Indigenous people, people of the water. And I've always been told that we need to continue to look at the water, pray for the water, more importantly, feed the water, because that's life to us. That's what water has done for us. I really truly hope that the people here today look at 2 generations from now when we talk about the Columbia River or water just itself, because we really need to continue to plan for those things. But maybe I should kind of stop. I don't want to go too far, but that's who we are. I think we need to be a little more patient. I hope you guys are patient today, and kind of have an open mind, kind of try to absorb really what we're trying to do here at Northwest Indian College. I really think Emma's doing a great job. You know, we need to do these things more, just not one time out of 5 years, I think. But it's important, or you wouldn't be here today. But I welcome you guys to our land, our territory. I don't want to speak for our son. He's the chairman of the tribe, but I'm pretty sure he would say, please welcome to Lummi. So I better stop, Emma. Thank you for being here. Please have an open mind, and please enjoy this salmon dinner this evening. The salmon dinner really feeds our spirit of who we are as a people. So I better stop. Our great friend here from the plains, you know, I need to leave room for her.
For your opening words, and now I'm going to pass it over to our Vice President at Northwest Indian College, Carol Rave, who has graciously agreed to welcome us from Northwest Indian College.
Yes, thank you. President Guillory couldn't be with us this afternoon, and he sends his apologies. He's a great leader, and he's also a great dad. So it's not, he's not ill, but his baby is. So we really appreciate our president. Welcome to Northwest Indian College and the Coast Salish Institute. On behalf of President Guillory, our Board of Trustees, our staff and faculties and students, we extend a special welcome to our elders, our beloved elders who will be joining us today and tomorrow. And thank you to the organizers, sponsors, and presenters. Once again, good afternoon, relatives and honorable guests. I'm Carol Rave, Vice President for Instruction and Student Services. I have earned 2 Lakota names, and I want to explain them. My first name that I received is Giyan Omaniwi, which in English translation means woman who travels by flying. And in the early days, when I was in the 9th grade, I was really young when I graduated from high school. But I flew to Reading, Massachusetts to complete my high school education there. And that was my first flight. I had never flown before. During those times, only tribal chairmen, council people flew to Washington, D.C. to take care of business. So during those times, there were hardly any others who flew. So that's how I received my first Lakota name from my grandparents. My second Lakota name is Wakiyan Washtewi, which in English translation means good thunder woman. And in Lakota thought, it means that the Thunders adopted me as their relative. So when you see those big, scary storm clouds out there, remember me, because they adopted me and they took me in as their relative. So I have their protection. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about myself and how I grew up in the culture. I also earned 3 eagle plumes, and each time I earned an eagle plume, my parents had a traditional giveaway and they fed the people. I was raised by my community in accordance to the words, "It takes a village to raise a child," and that was truly me. I was everywhere. I loved my people. And so they recognized that. And at one of my honorings, people said that about me. We raised her. I was fluent in the Lakota language since childhood. I knew no English at all. And so it reminds me that I'm very close to those treaty days. I'm a full-blood. I knew my language. I knew nothing about technology. I was raised out in the country where there was no electricity or running water. And so I know those times, and I know how clear our thoughts were back in those days. Also, I want to talk about Northwest Indian College. We are a house of learning for Native students. And currently, this winter quarter, our students represent 82 different tribes across Indian country. We are the only tribal college in the Northwest, and we have extended campuses at Swinomish, Tulalip, Port Gamble, Sklallam, Muckleshoot, Nisqually, and Nez Perce in Idaho. Can you raise your hand, Angela? So the Nez Perce people here. Yes. My last comment that I want to say to you, those of you who really don't know us as Native people, that we are a people of our word, and our word must be accurately captured and accurately translated. So if you say something to me, I believe that what you said you were going to do, Same the other way around. If I say something, especially to my children, they're going to know that I'm going to follow through. Again, welcome, and may the spirits of our ancestors and for those yet unborn guide you in your work. Mitakuye Owasin, which means we are all related in the Lakota language. So at this time, if you could please stand and shake the hands of two people you don't know and introduce yourself and say where you are from, especially our students and the tribal people.
I'm Barbara.
Nice to meet you.
I love your words. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I appreciate you for coming and being with us.
How are you doing?
Thank you very much for the good visiting. I really want to thank our Vice President, Carol Rave, for her wonderful words, and Timbaloo Sr. for opening us up in a good way. This is really important work, and we like to make sure that we have our welcomings. So another component of this was we want to make sure that we understand the intent of this work. And the first part of this work actually came from obviously the Columbia River Treaty Basin and the need to look at it intellectually and move it forward in terms of the governance process. But how did we as a committee come together to bring you all here today from up and down the Columbia River Basin throughout the Salish Sea, all the way from Ottawa and Washington, D.C.? How did we come here today? Well, it was actually Senator Maria Cantwell who brought us together today. And she, I think in a gentle nudge hallway conversation / email, said, we would like to move to focus on the Columbia River, and Western Washington University, will you, Border Policy Research Institute, Huxley College of the Environment, Can-Am Studies, work and move this work forward. And as good neighbors, Western Washington University reached out to Northwest Indian College. And we said, of course, we'll step into that work. And so with that, Maria Cantwell was unfortunately not able to be here today, but she sent a letter. And so I'm going to read that to you before we get started. And thank you to the panelists for being so patient. Greetings, dear friends, greetings and welcome to the Columbia River Treaty Symposium hosted by Northwest Indian College and Western Washington University. I regret I am unable to join you for this important discussion of the future of the Columbia River Treaty and how it will impact the United States, Canada, and Indian Country. The Columbia River Basin has not been revised since 1964. The negotiations to modernize this treaty will impact generations to come on issues as diverse as water quality, fishing sustainability, clean energy generation, and mitigating the impacts of climate change. I am proud that Washington stakeholders have taken the lead to develop regional recommendations to modernize the treaty. I will work to ensure that negotiators listen and act upon these recommendations to modernize the treaty, balancing ecosystem function, flood control, and hydropower generation. The United States Department of State has a negotiator team in place, right here, and approved negotiating authority in October 2016. However, the United States and Canada still have not officially launched talks. I will continue to urge the Trump administration and Prime Minister Trudeau to modernize the Columbia River Treaty. It would be a win-win opportunity for both our countries to improve joint management of this important resource for the 21st century in a way that protects the environment and drives new opportunities to work jointly on critical energy solutions such as smart grids and power storage. Thank you all for taking time to be part of this vital dialogue surrounding the Columbia River Treaty negotiations. I look forward to hearing about your ideas and to continue the dialogue in the weeks and the months ahead. Please accept my best wishes for a successful symposium. Warmest regard, Maria Cantwell, United States Senator. So thank you to Maria, our Senator Cantwell, for those important words. And thank you to the negotiators for coming and opening up space for us to have this important dialogue from the United States and Canada as well. So thank you very much. And all of our tribal nations leaders who particularly worked on the modernization documents. Before we, one more one more thing that we have to do before we start the work, and this is all part of the work, is to call witnesses. And so calling witnesses is an important part of Coast Salish tradition. This is acknowledging of the Lummi oral history. Carrying on the tradition is very important. The people who are called to witness are the ones who are asked to carry on the message of today's work. In this work, in years to come, these witnesses may be asked to recount the work that occurred here today in this room together. Tonight, the speakers will be called for the dinner to recount what happened today. I would like first to call Steve Hollenhurst. Steve is the Dean of Huxley College in Western Washington University. I would also like to call Angela Picard, who's NESPER's site manager at Northwest Indian College and traveled with students in a van to get here. Thank you. Thirdly, I'd like to call Laurel Ballou, Tribal Governance and Business Management Department Chair and Swinomish Community Member. Oh.
Sesihamia.
Sesiamia. Sesiamia. Lastly, I would like to call from the Upper Columbia, Mike Marchand from the Colville tribe. Mike Marchand. Okay. Thank you very much for agreeing to be witnesses for this important work. As you see, we have video cameras here that are documenting and will be made publicly available, but we also have our oral historians, and our community members and those that call to witness will be carrying this message forward in the oral tradition. So with that work, thank you. Now we can turn our attention to our panelists. And we have set the context as to why we're here and that welcoming you. And now it's just my my pleasure to for the first presentation on the history of the Columbia River Treaty and how does this negotiation set up new governance. So we have Barb Cousins, who's a professor at the University of Idaho College of Law and who's been in this work for a long time, and thank you very much for being here today. We have Gregory Lemmermeyer from Global Affairs Canada. Thank you very much for coming and sitting in. I know Kathy Eichenberger was called away at the last minute from the BC Ministry of Energy and Mines, and thank you for stepping in and serving in this important role. We also have Jay Johnson, First Nation, Okanagan, and being able to be involved in the treaty negotiation process. Thank you for coming today. And lastly, we have Richard Paisley, who's the director, a good friend, and the director of the Global Transboundary International Waters Governance Initiative at the University of British Columbia. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Barb, and each of you have 10 minutes to speak, and then we're going to be opening up for questions after that. And we have a timekeeper up there. So Barb, over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the organizers of this for pulling together such a great gathering on short notice. So, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we are on, the Lummi Nation, and thank you for hosting us here. I have a tremor, so I'm going to get behind this. I'm sorry, my apologies to people behind the curtain like Oz. I love the openings and the reminder that when we are talking about water, we are talking about so much more than simply a commodity. And so I have to apologize to say now where we're going to go is just to this sort of technical background on why do we have the treaty. So my charge is to bring everybody up to the same level on what the treaty is, why we have it, why it's under review, and what the review process on the United States has done, and then turn it over to Greg to talk about the review process on the Canadian side. So that's my charge. But I love the reminder, Tim's concept of 2 generations, because this summer I'm going to become a grandmother for the first time. I'm so excited. Next time we get together, I'll bring pictures. Okay, so the Columbia River is shared by the United States and Canada. In the early 40s, the International Joint Commission, which is established between the U.S. and Canada, was asked to look at ways to have joint benefits for the people on both sides of the border from coming together and managing the Columbia River. And that moved along slowly, and as always happens, it took a major crisis to really catalyze it moving forward, and that was the floods of 1948. And so not a lot more than average snowpack, but a rain-on-snow event that brought it all off at once, and we always use the Dalles as kind of the point for comparing measurement. Reportedly, it was 1 million cubic feet per second at the Dalles. The levee broke at Vanport, Oregon, which was a shipyard community between Portland and the Columbia River, completely wiped out the town. 15 people lost their life. It still took, even with that, until 1961, until a treaty was negotiated, and 1964 when it went into force. Okay, so the Columbia River Treaty that went into force in 1964 is for 2 purposes, flood control and hydropower. So there was an agreement to build 3 dams in Canada and allowed to build another Libby Dam in the United States. United States paid $65 million for 60 years of flood control, and the water that was released from those dams that would produce hydroelectricity as it went through all the dams on the Columbia River in the United States, 50% of that incremental power would be the Canadian entitlement, would be shared with Canada. Canada did not need it at the time, so the U.S. Congress authorized the Northwest-Southwest intertie, and that power was initially sold under 30-year contracts of sale for $254 million. And then what the treaty asked for was each government had to appoint the operating entities. And in 1964, we viewed operation of a river as being something for engineers to do. So on the U.S. side, it was 2 people, the administrator of BPA and the division manager of the Northwest Division of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And on the BC side, it was an entity, BC Hydro. Okay, so why is this treaty under review? Well, that 60-year time period of flood control expires in 2024. So 60 years, then it expires. That's the really conservative, what we call assured flood control. Everything else continues. At any time in the operation of a treaty, the parties to it can come together and end it or modify it. But something also unusual about the Columbia River Treaty is at the same time as that expiration, the words of the treaty allow either country to walk away, so unilateral termination. To do so, they must give 10 years notice. We're within that 10-year window. Neither side has given notice yet. So kind of a narrow change in the treaty in 2024. So why is the scope so broad? And the way the organizers have set it up, we're going to have panels throughout the rest of today and tomorrow that kind of go to the scope of what has changed since 1964. So I'm just going to introduce those concepts again to get us all on the same page. So the first thing is energy. In 1964, we had a very steeply growing demand for energy, and everyone thought that by now hydropower would not be worth as much because the base load, the primary supply in the basin would come from nuclear power. Hydropower would be worth less. Of course, with the oil embargo of the 1970s, we found out the power of conservation, that we could actually conserve our way not only out of a crisis, but out of the need for new power plants. So in the Pacific Northwest, hydropower remains our most important supply of energy. It is extremely valuable. Remember, the first 30 years of the Canadian entitlement sold for $254 million. Since those contracts expired, it has sold for as high as $350 million in 1 year. It's been lower in recent years because of the natural gas coming onto the market and the energy market going down. Climate change, you'll have a panel talking about that. And what you see on your right is actually measured changes in timing of flow, and when you're operating dams for hydropower, that's really important. What we're seeing at lower latitudes and lower elevations is our watersheds are changing from snow-dominated to rain-dominated. We're losing natural storage. The runoff is on average 2 weeks earlier than it would have been in the past. On your left, you see the predictions on climate change going forward, and basically what you see is with increasing temperature, you have increasing vegetative demand. And so that will affect our ecosystems, that will affect our agriculture within the region. Ecosystem has changed dramatically. What you see on the left here is the parts of the river, 37% of the river that formerly had salmon spawning that's now blocked from it. Those are not treaty dams. Those are other dams that block that area. But what you see in the hydrograph is what we did on purpose with those dams is we reduced the big spring runoff that would wash smolts out to the ocean and flatten the hydrograph so we could produce electricity year-round so that we could reduce flood risk. But the big story is what's changed since 1964 is that we as people have illustrated we care about that by passing in the United States the Endangered Species Act and in Canada the Species at Risk Act. And so what you see on that slide up there are the populations of salmon, steelhead, and the 2 resident species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. I think the biggest story in the basin is the change in empowerment and capacity to participate in a process like this by the people of the basin. Columbia Basin Trust and Northwest Power and Conservation Council did not exist at that time, and both have taken on the role of trying to educate people within the Columbia River Basin on what's happening as the treaty review process moved forward. But the biggest tribe, and it's very fitting that we are here at Northwest Indian College to talk about this, is the huge increase of capacity and empowerment of the tribes within the basin. In Canada, the Constitution in 1982 recognized the rights of Aboriginal people to land and water and the requirement of consultation. Recent litigation has recognized a very broad scope for that. And in the United States, there are 15 reservations within the U.S. portion of the Columbia River. And litigation over treaty fishing rights has recognized those rights and really elevated the tribes, in my view, as co-managers within the basin. And the capacity that's been built on that is absolutely amazing, and it is played out in the review process. In 2010, the 15 tribes came together and they put forward a document called the Common Views on the Future of the Columbia River Treaty. I cannot emphasize as much what a huge, sophisticated act of diplomacy this was, and the 15 tribes have stayed behind that document throughout the review process. If the states in this basin were that sophisticated and actually came together and actually reached out to the tribes, we could have a regional solution for the Columbia River Basin. That sophistication of the tribes has played out in the regional review. What the process was in the regional review was that BPA and Army Corps brought together a sovereign review team with 5 representatives of the 15 tribes, 1 representative from each of the 4 main states within the basin. They held basin-wide listening sessions, and in December of 2013 transmitted a regional recommendation to the Department of State. And that said we should have going forward 3 purposes of cooperation on the Columbia River: hydropower with some changes, flood control with some changes, and ecosystem function. And that elevation of ecosystem function is a tribute to the work of the tribes. And then finally, something that everyone raised throughout the process is that it's not 1964 anymore. We expect a public voice in these major policy decisions. We need more of a decision-making body, and we need it open to the public. So I was just going to explain very briefly a little bit about setting up each of those 3 prongs, what some of the issues are, to set it up for the panels that will come forward. I really like this cross-section of the river because it helps you see that when water is released from one of the little maple leaf dams, that means Canada, it produces hydropower through every single other one of those dams it comes through. And half of that increment is the Canadian entitlement. Well, under U.S. law, if a domestic law passed after a treaty is implemented in a way that conflicts with the treaty, U.S. courts will say, sorry, agencies, you have to follow the later enacted law. In order to avoid that, which would be breach of the treaty, the U.S. bends over backwards not to. So, when under the Endangered Species Act, water is spilled at any of these dams and hydropower is not produced, the United States still plays Canada as if that power was produced. So that's to avoid breach of the treaty, but you can imagine this is why the utilities in the United States don't like the way the Canadian entitlement is calculated. Flood control. The United States has maintained through assured flood control a very conservative approach to making sure that we do not risk flood by looking at keeping the flow to 450,000 CFS at the Dalles. Actually, there is no, at least publicly available, study that looks at whether that is actually necessary. And I had a student who I had look at the times when we have surpassed 450,000 CFS, and then what the newspapers said about the consequences. 86 times since 1974, we have surpassed that, once as high as 550,000 CFS. And at least according to the newspapers, definitely flooding, but minor damage, no threat to life, and the type of damage that does not cause huge economic harm and potentially could be handled by structure. At the very least, that shows that a major study is done. It could not only narrow the space between the US and Canada on this issue, but if that space is narrowed and we go for higher flows, we have suddenly freed up these dams for far greater flexibility going forward for other issues. Okay, ecosystem function. This is a really difficult one because what is it? It depends on the person, what your perspective is, and also it can have different definitions depending on whether you're looking at the whole basin, a watershed, or a local area. So what should we be looking at? A lot of thought would have to go into this. The issues that come up range from flow to fish passage to local habitat. And the one thing I would say on this to talk about in the dialogues going forward is, does every single issue need to rise to the level of an international treaty? Because that's pretty cumbersome. Or do some issues like flow need to, and other issues need to be coordinated by the people of the basin across that border? Okay, so what are the next steps? In 2013, the regional recommendation went forward. The 2 years following that, the congressional delegation from the basin sent letters to Department of State saying, please start negotiations. In a letter that was supposedly confidential and immediately went viral, Department of State answered back, yes, we're intending to, probably along the lines of the regional negotiation. Appointment of Brian Doherty, who is kindly here to help us and to listen to us, was appointed as lead negotiator, and it's my understanding that what's called the Circular 175 process has been completed. That is the internal process of the Department of State to decide what they have to do to comply with the Constitution in this instance. The U.S. Constitution asks for the advice and consent of the Senate on a treaty, but in reality, I think it's 94% of the international agreements that we negotiate don't rise to that level. So you have to look at, does this rise to that level? So that's where we're at. That's what the U.S. review did, and I'm going to turn it over to Greg to talk about the Canadian perspective, and thank you very much.
A little bit. Thanks, Barb. I want to thank you all for the warm welcome here on Lumi territory and at Northwest Indian College. The organizers have done a great job, and I really appreciate that. Also, will pass regrets from Kathy Eichenberger, who wasn't able to come due to some late arising commitments, but I'm sure she'll hear all about this from many different sides. So there you go. The review process, so what Kathy's presentation planned to look at, and I can elaborate on, is the review process as it happened in Canada. So next slide, please. As Barb said, described the treaty signed in 61, ratified in 64. Part of this is, within Canada, the delay was caused for two reasons. Part of it was to reach the Canada-BC agreement to determine responsibilities for implementation of the treaty between the federal and provincial partners, and also to determine which entities would be involved. As Barb said, BC Hydro is the Canadian entity for implementation. The government of BC is the entity with respect to disposal of the entitlement. Reviewed the treaty now. So in 2014, as was mentioned, this was the first opportunity where the termination of the treaty could move ahead. A lot had changed in the intervening period. There was a change in there was change in the relationship with the government between even the role of citizens, changes in societal values, much greater importance placed on environmental issues, and some dramatic changes, not just culturally, but within the Canadian Constitution with respect to the role of Indigenous peoples. One of the biggest things that happened with the Columbia River Treaty was the imposition of these significant changes in engineering of the river without a significant without any real consultation process for the people involved, and this is simply not the way things can happen anymore. So there was a real sense of the idea, if we were with the potential for renewal to come, that we needed to do it right, and this led to the BC renewal process. So part of this process involved engagement engagement with the First Nations in Canada. The Quebec, Tunaka, and Okanagan First Nations all exist within the Columbia River Basin north of the border. BC was the procedural lead for engaging with the different First Nations. There was federal government participation in all the engagements, and the government-to-government engagement was tailored for each First Nation according to their ability, desire, and capacity to engage. There was also a broad public consultation, 3 rounds of consultations in 23 different events over a year and a half. There's an active social media campaign behind this to ensure as broad a participation as possible for basin residents. And these different consultation processes led to the eventual draft recommendation. And then finally, in March 2014, it led to the BC decision. So generally, this reflects the input that was received during these consultations with local governments as well. And the kind of overarching decision was to continue with the treaty in its current format, but to seek improvements as possible. Within the BC decision document, there were 14 principles that were espoused to guide that explained what the decision was and guide government decision making going forward. The high-level themes that came out of that is represented within those 14 principles. One is the idea of creating benefits and sharing them equitably. The idea that there's a lot of value that is generated. A lot of value comes from the upstream regulation of waters in Canada to a broad range of U.S. interests, and that treaty operations continue to have to impact Canadian basin residents and regional interests. So next slide. Other aspects that are important in looking at what renewal might have to cover are climate change and the unpredictability that lies therein. The expectation the treaty will probably need to be a more adaptable document if it is to continue another 60 years versus the first 60 years of its existence. And then also the idea that as indicated by interest in the United States, there's a need to incorporate ecosystems and to explore how other further improvements could be made to the treaty. So within the Canadian team, there's a sense that we need to understand and agree on what the value is of collaborative water management within the Columbia River Basin. We, of course, and feel this on the other side as well, believe in the value of dialogue to try and determine best paths forward and narrow the differences between our perspectives. And of course, there's the idea, as I mentioned, this will hopefully seek to reach an agreement that will go far into the future, and we need to have adaptive principles so that this provides for future generations in an effective way. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And I'll turn things over to Jay.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, everybody, for having me. Wai Lim Limt. I just want to acknowledge the Lumbee Nation and thank you for the honor of asking us to come here and speak today, and the beautiful facilities you've built and share with your community and you've shared with us is an honor to be part of it. So today I want to talk a little bit about I've got a slide presentation here that'll just come up in a second, but I want to talk a little bit about the role of the Okanagan Nation in the Columbia Review process. We've of course the Columbia River Treaty has had a monumentous impact on the nation, on its territory, and we have. We've been involved, our nation has been involved in the Columbia River Treaty since its conception. But there's a huge difference from how the nation is being recognized from the past to today, and where we seem to be going in the future. And I want to talk a little bit about those differences and give you some perspective. And then I'd be happy to talk a little bit more, maybe during the question period, about what our internal processes and external processes are now and how our involvement is in the rollout structurally. eventually, but there's plenty of time to get into that. But so the Okanagan Nation, the Silks Nation, is comprised of 7 communities north of the 49th parallel, the Osoyoos Indian Band, Penticton, West Bank, Okanagan Indian Band, Upper Similkameen, Lower Similkameen Indian Band, and the Colville Confederated Tribes in the United States. And you can see there. The Okanagan Nation is essentially, as many of the communities along the river system, fundamentally a salmon people, and the relationship to salmon is profound and detailed, and spiritual, as well as economic and social, and the impacts and changes that happened along the Columbia River system with the creation of the dams and the focus on energy production and flood control alienated the salmon from their natural spawning grounds, and it cut off the indigenous communities from a primary relationship to fish and to salmon, and really put a significant squeeze on communities in a whole variety of ways. Next slide. The Okanagan Nation has been determined that the Silks consume 4 to 5 times more salmon than any other game animal. So this is really something that was quite profound when the salmon stopped coming up into Canada. The CRT impacts, as you'll hear from all the communities and tribes and along the river system, was profound. In Canada, there was a flooding out of thousands of hectares of land, prime valley lands, prime lands for harvesting, for agricultural purposes, for spiritual purposes. There was a loss of habitat. Hundreds of thousands of species were lost during the flooding process. Village sites were inundated. Burial grounds were flooded. All of this occurred without any dialogue with the First Nation communities. So land essentially was just taken from the communities, and people were beginning to be forced out of those valleys as a result of that. And access was denied for sacred areas, access were denied to fishing grounds, etc. Grand Coulee Dam, which is not obviously a CRT treaty dam, was the beginning of that significant change. And Grand Coulee and Chief Joe Dam both prevented and halted the passage of salmon up into the Upper Columbia. And there was a letter sent in the I believe in the 30s from the federal department in Canada that in response to a question that would it almost as an afterthought from the United States, asking if there would be an issue with cutting off a commercial fishery in Canada, and the response was back that the response happened in 7 days. So in 1932, this is obviously a high priority issue for the government in Canada. The response came back saying, "Dear sir, your understanding and acknowledgement that these dams will not cut off a commercial fishery is correct." And that was the essence of the letter. There's no mention of what that impact does to communities, how this completely alters the way of life for the Indigenous communities and the non-Indigenous communities that were along the river system. So it's something that redress needs to happen soon, and there's a considerable amount of effort being channeled to try to address that and ensure that salmon are repatriated back into their natural habitat in north of Canada, which of course would benefit everyone. Yep. Again, this is a shot of Indigenous communities in the basin that essentially, for those that lived in various parts of the system, they woke up one day and the salmon weren't there, and then they weren't there again the next day and the next day and the year after year after year, and that shock is still felt today. Our chief, Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, chair of the Okanagan Nation Alliance and president of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, had a quote that the treaty has disrupted our way of life in ways that very few other things have. And yet, it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to change the future, that we can use this renegotiation process, given the changes that have happened with recognition of Indigenous communities that I'll speak about in a moment, given the understanding of the importance and the centrality of ecosystems within a contemporary treaty or within any waterway governance, and the attention that communities all around the basin and all around the state and all around the province have to the kinds of impacts that these industrial decisions of this magnitude have to their way of life, and use it as a teaching moment as well. And so there's also great hope here. And that leads to, what is this context that we're talking about? What is the context of the rise of Indigenous communities in Canada and in the United States? Well, in Canada, it's specific. Some things have happened that are fundamental. It was mentioned, Barb mentioned earlier, and the Constitution was brought back in the early 80s. That entrenched title and rights into the Constitution for Indigenous communities. And that ensured that legislation decisions going in the future must include an engagement with First Nations communities. What that engagement was is seen as consultation. What is consultation? It's a whole series of laws and case that have put a finer point on exactly what consultation means. We've now moved to a new era. And number one is the Silcotin decision that happened in 2014. That new era is one of consent. It's a consent-based regime. The UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, Canada finally endorsed that after many years and is now in the process of reviewing all federal legislation to ensure that that those conflicts between existing legislation and the commitment in UNDRIP are addressed. What that will mean is that First Nations need to be not only involved and informed and so on, but that there would be a requirement for a consent-based process, free and informed prior consent to these decisions. And that is something that communities are preparing for. That's something that Indigenous nations are structuring and reorganizing around to ensure their internal governance systems can handle that responsibility and be able to implement it appropriately. And so the Okanagan Nation itself has, over the years, worked from a few people in a basement with some card tables trying to work on salmon restoration to buildings and now one of the only Indigenous salmon hatcheries in Canada with 100 staff. And we're bringing salmon back into the Okanagan system that are all through the Columbia system. TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was born out of the residential school experience and the requirement and need to try to reconcile that, to quote the actual report, the cultural genocide that occurred with Indigenous communities as children from 1897 to 1996, during the whole era of residential schools. Many children were forcibly removed from their parents for no cause at ages as young as 5 and educated away from their communities in a different language with a different culture, and often abuses happened during that experience. And so that is part of the dynamic of social and political need for reconciliation with Indigenous people, and communities on both sides are starting to take that seriously and organize around it. And so essentially we're moving from a space of denial to implementation and now recognition. So the Silcotin decision. Well, essentially Aboriginal title is real, it's meaningful, and it exists over large tracts of land. It's not that there's small spots of where your where Indigenous fishing rocks were, or where First Nations carried out a specific spiritual practice, but it's a territorial-wide understanding of title. Aboriginal title includes the vesting of full beneficial and economic interest in the land to the Aboriginal group. Where Aboriginal title exists, consent of the Aboriginal group is required for the Crown or industry to use that land, and failing consent, the Crown has to meet the test of justifiable infringement, which of course is also deep and iterative and isn't just something that is a throwaway. And I just want to point out to those that haven't had a chance to read the Silcotin decision, it is so striking that the Chief Justice went out of her way to say, this is the Chief Justice writing, and I am explicitly using the word consent. Governments and third parties must realize their obligations to consent. So this places First Nations in a very central and formal position when these kinds of broad-based decisions under the land and the water and the resources of which communities have historically depended upon are going to be altered in significant ways. It for the first time requires that there's an obligation with the Government of Canada and with the provincial government to involve First Nations in Canada in a really deep and iterative way, and we're all organizing and rising to that challenge. And if Crown authorities authorizes activities on the land which are demonstrated to be Aboriginal title lands. Projects, permits may be cancelled and damages may be owed to Aboriginal groups. So in Canada, we don't have as long of a history with punitive litigation. We don't have a long history, particularly in Indigenous communities, in a legal environment of being in a position to sue for damages. Those costs of going to court are usually prohibitive, and those timelines are also often prohibitive. And for the first time, this kind of puts third parties and government on notice that this door is open now. It's open in a significant way, where there will likely be an expectation that legal challenges will occur for projects that are damaging and so on. Okay. On DRIP, essentially we talked about that. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine, develop priorities and strategies for the development and use of their lands or territories and other resources. We'll go to the next slide. Truth and Reconciliation Commission, again, set the foundation for what we're moving towards, which is an era of reconciliation and involvement. So what are the O&A Indigenous needs as a result to the CRT? Fisheries restoration and mitigation. Fish passage needs to be restored. Resolution of industrial reservoirs and an ongoing impacts. So BC Hydro in Canada, in our opinion, is grossly negligent in trying to redress the kinds of impacts that the CRT and its ongoing operations have created on the territory in the reservoirs, turning rivers and lakes and industrial basins into bathtubs, and that has to be studied and resolved, and mitigation efforts put in that are of significance. Deeper involvement and consistent with the Supreme Court decision of Silkatine, so that we are in fact recognized as being central within those discussions. We're looking to do that. We're organizing to do that. That ecosystem functions. Now, I'm not a big fan of that phrase, but certainly ecosystems and the environment needs to be the foundation, not an add-on into the treaty. It needs to be the foundation for how we start to understand the river system, how we start to understand its needs and outcomes. And we add on uses of power. We add on restrictions for flood control. We don't start with flood control and power and then just sort of add on ecosystems. I think that's illogical in a lot of our minds. And lastly, meaningful economic benefits. The Indigenous communities have not benefited from in any substantial way from the economic values that have been a result of the treaty, and that has to change. Those resources have to flow back into the communities who are most impacted by them, and an ongoing role for decision making. So, great, thank you.
I think you've had enough PowerPoint. My name is Richard Paisley, and I teach international law at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. But I've had the privilege of working on both sides of the border with tribes and First Nations. And I also do most of my work, though, internationally. So I get to go to the Nile and the Mekong and a lot less glamorous places like Afghanistan, where I was last week, and the sands and other places. And I think a couple of things I wanted to say. First thing, you are not alone. There are lots of places in the world, 263 for those who keep score, that are trying to conserve and manage international waters. And there's a great reservoir of knowledge out there. I've been asked to talk about international waters governance, and there are better mousetraps out there. But having said that, and things we can learn, things we can all learn from, careful examination of how other places deal with very similar issues to what we deal with. And I should have also said, first of all, I apologize. I forgot to acknowledge the Lummi people and the Lummi land we're on, and I'm very grateful for being here. And also to Emma, who's a real treasure, and you're very lucky to have her. She inspires me in the work I do internationally. She really is an inspiration and a great force. So I guess my point is, you can learn from other places. There's a tremendous amount to be learned, and we don't tend to do that, generally speaking. We're somewhat myopic. We look at Canada and the US and we see that as our whole world. As far as the governance issues on the Columbia generally go, I guess the observations that I would make are these. First of all, the Columbia River Treaty, for all its foibles, is considered a world-class example of how to share benefits between countries. It is really the paradigm example of how upstream and downstream countries can cooperate. okay? So, and indeed, I go around the world telling people what this wonderful thing, that for one of the first times in history, and it's been emulated by others now, an upstream country is getting benefit from things that happen downstream, and a downstream country is getting benefit from something that happens upstream. So to throw out the baby with the bathwater, to blow up the treaty, as some people are saying, I think is a really a limited strategy. And it's made even more manifest by the fact that I don't know how the U.S. political system works particularly well, although I did go to law school in California, so I have some awareness and appreciation. But you only have to read the newspapers or listen to the media now to know that the chances of a new treaty going successfully through the U.S. Congress are not good, I guess, is the diplomatic way of putting it. So to blow up the treaty and then put yourself in the vagaries of the current administration in Washington, it seems is not a great plan either. So I would exhort all those who work on the treaty, both on the U.S. side and the Canadian side, to think carefully about how we can achieve the objectives that people say we need to achieve, which I tend to agree with, and do it outside of blowing up the treaty process or destroying the treaty or depending on so coming up with a new treaty that would replace the old treaty. So the two things, and my colleagues have as always, done a masterful job of illuminating the two big issues that are out there right now. One is ecosystem function, and Jay put it very well. Why would we sort of use the ecosystem function as an add-on? This, of course, supposes, and others have alluded to this, that we all agree what ecosystem function is or what the best way to deal with that is. And believe me, there's no consensus on that. But even if we could achieve consensus, we need to think carefully about how we're going to make the ecosystem a priority. And this is something that the First Nations and the tribes have done for generations. So there's a lot to be learned there as well. The second sort of overriding factor, it seems to me, that's come out of the consultations on both sides of the border, and it's in keeping with sort of the zeitgeist of where the world is now in terms of participation, is how can people have a meaningful role in sort of operating the conservation and management, okay, of the treaty or of the Columbia River, governance generally. It's generally conceded that times have changed since the 1960s, and it's time that people generally, and the First Nations and tribes in particular, but also NGOs and everyone else with an interest on both sides of the border, needs to have a more meaningful role. So the challenge, it seems to me, is how do you do that again without blowing up the treaty? How do you find a way to meaningfully incorporate people, meeting their legal rights and obligation, but also making it so that they feel that they're part of the system, so that they have a genuine and sincere role in trying to manage the river in a better way, okay? And there's no crisp answer to that. It's not like there's a magic bullet out there, but it's going to be an exercise, I think, at best in active adaptive management. But it seems to me that there are some basic principles that need to be followed. And I've had the privilege of working with various people, tribes and First Nations in particular, but others as well, on both sides of the border, to try to imagineer a better way of governing the Columbia, okay? I mean, the smart money is now saying that even if the Columbia River Treaty is adjusted, it'll be adjusted only incrementally, because that's the nature of politics on both sides of the border. But if you really are sincere, and what an immense challenge, but also a tremendous opportunity to reimagine how the Columbia is governed, and why not have the tribes and First Nations play a prominent role in doing that? If not now, when? If not us, who is going to do it, right? And so we've been working, Jay and I and the people, the coalition of tribes, Barb, a bunch of us, trying to imagineer a better way of governing the Columbia on both sides of the border that takes into consideration these representational issues, that takes into consideration these ecosystem issues, but doesn't, throw out the baby with the bathwater and junk unnecessarily without having something to replace it. Things like, flood control and power generation, okay? So, whatever we do, I think, and this is my experience throughout the world, we're probably not going to get it right away, But that's, again, why we need to do it thoughtfully and carefully and inclusively, and then build into whatever mechanism we come up with the idea that we can self-correct as time goes on, and we can sort of slowly evolve into the kind of system that we really need. And I think, rather than my canned speech and my funny PowerPoint slides, I think that's what I'd like to say, and I'm thankful to you for giving me the opportunity to say it. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm Eileen Delahanty-Perks. I'm a writer and researcher. I have a question for the Global Affairs Canada. I wonder, I know the BC decision officially is that salmon reintroduction above Grand Coulee is not on the table for the negotiating process, but I wonder whether or not the federal government might have any different attitudes about salmon reintroduction, since it was originally the federal government who blocked passage with their permission letter that Jay very kindly presented to us.
Sure, I can answer that, although a couple little clarifications on parts of your question. I don't think BC has ever said that it can't be part of the treaty. What they're saying is it's a federal issue. So it was not part of their decision because they consider it to be a federal issue rather than a provincial issue. And they I don't have it memorized, and I don't have a copy here with me, but their general statement about it is that it's a federal issue because it's an anadromous fish. This is, I think, Fisheries Act stuff, and so it would be up for the federal government to decide how or in what way this issue could play into the Columbia River Treaty renewal. And I don't think we have a specific, position on that. As you know, we don't have a negotiating mandate yet, so we don't have anything specific. And in examining potential ecosystem function within the river, how fish live within the river would be part of it. I wouldn't say that the Canadian government is responsible for blocking the fish. We didn't build Grand Coulee Dam. Certainly, we didn't take a very productive approach to ensure that salmon continued to run the Columbia. So there's a little bit of guilt there, but I wouldn't say we're responsible for it.
Yeah, I can't resist adding, this is a very good example. I mean, salmon are the elephant in the room on the Columbia River, and yet what's the point of talking about the Columbia River and the Columbia River Treaty if they're not going to be included in the discussion? Because if you're going to talk about Columbia River governance, I mean, as Jay has pointed and others have pointed out, that's what it's all about, right? So I can't, very good question. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add further to that. Our position is that we don't know, but we may not have had the same CRT agreement if the situation was different, if fish were still continuing to go up into the upper Columbia. So what I mean by that is that Canada and the treaty benefited from an economic position by not having to address salmon and to accommodate salmon needs in the construction of their dams. And so that, if you looked at Mica, for example, the estimates for trying to put fish ladders into Mica Dam in the far north of the basin are in the hundreds and hundreds of millions, and that's just to be kind about it. So we think it's linked by virtue of that kind of an association just on the surface alone. So.
And since there's one U.S. up here with 3 Canadians, I'll just say we are responsible. We did build Grand Coulee and Chief Joseph.
We tried to be purposely provocative, so please. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Raylene Gold from the League of Women Voters from Seattle. I wanted to ask about, the power group in the U.S. Has been saying, the Canadians' entitlement is way over what it should be, and we should terminate the treaty. They've said that at times. And I wonder if you could explain a little more. I didn't quite get how they use the current laws to talk about that we're overpaying the Canadians, but also how in the negotiations are we going to work out what they've been saying versus what the Canadians are saying about all the benefits that are accruing to the U.S. from a shared treaty.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah,
So they all look at the U.S. here. So I'm an academic, though I can't really speak for the U.S. government. But so what happens with the Canadian entitlement? So first of all, it's 50% of the added increment of electricity that is produced when water is released from a dam in Canada, and then it goes through a turbine in the United States. Now in the United States, because of the listings of salmon, there are times of the year when we spill water rather than producing power. When we do that, we nevertheless calculate the Canadian entitlement as if that water ran through a turbine. And so to the utilities, when they look at that from their perspective, they see we lost power from spilling and we paid for 50% of it. So every time we spill, it's 150% lost to us. Because the other thing to say about the Canadian entitlement is we talk about it in monetary terms, but it is an amount of power. Right now, British Columbia simply sells that back to U.S. utilities, and that's why we translate it into money. But it's an amount of power, hydropower.
So the amount, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so the other part of your question, so that's the problem that comes from the utilities. And then the second part of what Raylene was saying is that what the position of British Columbia has been, not to speak for you, but since Kathy isn't here, she's said this to me.
If you say something, I have to, anyways, go ahead.
Yeah, then you could jump in and say she's totally wrong. What Kathy has said is that there are other benefits from releasing water from the dams in Canada. So they have benefits for ecosystem, they have benefits from moving salmon out. So actually, the Canadian entitlement should be bigger. Well, what I haven't heard from the U.S., but the same thing, you could take the same tactic, and basically that position is, but for the dams, this would not happen in the United States. Well, the United States could say the same thing. So one of the reasons why Canada still sells the power to the United States is that turbines have been placed, hydropower facilities have been placed on each of these three dams in Canada, and then a fourth dam, Revelstoke, which is just a re-regulating reservoir, basically it allows yet another turbine for water to pass through, produces power. And so the dams in Canada produce power. There is no U.S. entitlement for the production of power in Canada. Yet you could say, but for the treaty and those dams being there, that wouldn't be produced. So you can get yourself into this process of each side saying, we get more, and it exactly goes back to your statement as to, so how do you narrow that? Because really what you're talking about is how you split this benefit. And I think in negotiations, how you narrow that is what you need to have happen on the other issues that are in front of you. And on both flood control and ecosystem function, they're much more broadly complex issues in which there are mutual benefits to working together. Then depending on where you are on that, you decide how to split the money, would be my basic view. Go ahead.
Yeah, you have to have, if you can believe this, some empathy for the mid-sea utilities, because they're paying for benefits they're not getting, right? Or in their minds at least, so that's frustrating. But as Barb has pointed out, from the Canadian perspective, you can do we're giving you quantities of water at specified times. And, we don't own the water, you don't own the water. According to international law, each basin state is entitled to a reasonable and equitable share of the beneficial uses of the water. So, we don't care how you pay us, but we want to be compensated for doing you a favor downstream. That's how the Canadians look at it.
Yeah.
So the issue is not really, I mean, I don't think anybody, well, some people argue, but I don't think seriously argue that the U.S. doesn't have to pay any compensation to Canada for receiving benefit from Canada. But the more interesting question is who pays that compensation, right? And the mid-C utilities say it isn't us. And, you know, who can blame them? But then the more interesting question is, well, how do you, especially in these days, get an act through the U.S. Congress or the Office of Management and Budget to get the ecosystems to pay for it, or get the fisheries to pay for it, or get the tribes to pay for it, because that's not going to happen, right? So again, you're back to, do you throw out the baby with the bathwater, or do you take the treaty that exists and adjust it in ways that aren't going to require it to have Senate approval or parliamentary approval in Canada? I mean, everybody talks about Senate approval and they point fingers at the current administration and so on and so forth, and, you know, raise their hands in horror that this is impossible. But we have a similar problem in Canada. It's not constitutionally enshrined, but as a matter of custom, Canadian governments are now legally, morally, ethically, whatever, politically obliged to consult with Parliament. And, you know, you can imagine the same thing happens. One of the slides I didn't show you was a picture of a former president of the U.S. and a former prime minister of Canada. And the president of the U.S. is saying to the prime minister, "I'll drink Canada dry." And he's taking a big slug of water. And, you know, water is a very political issue in Canada. I mean, you know, the weird thing is we export wheat, we export oil, we export gas, we export hockey players, but you talk about exporting water and whoo, you know, political, you know, solidarity across all political lines in Canada and total anathema. So don't underestimate that.
That's actually a beautiful way to pause and to thank this panel for their amazing work.